one of the things I learned as I was working on this book that was new to me is that in the first century, the sibling relationship was the most important one. It was the primary relationship that required the deepest loyalty and commitment, not marriage, but siblinghood. And I don't think that's really how things typically work in the US. But what this tells me is that when Jesus and Paul use the language of siblinghood for fellow believers, they are choosing the strongest language available to them to tell us how we're supposed to interact with each other.
Wow.
And I don't think they're saying we need to like reorganize how our family culture works in the US in 2025. But I do think they're telling us that the church, the people sitting beside us on a Sunday morning are to be like siblings to us, which is to say we need to reorganize our values and priorities around their flourishing, and so that we can truly support one another like a family. And that's radical.
All right, thank you for watching another episode of the Jude 3 Project podcast. As always, I'm your host, Lisa Fields, the founder and CEO of the Jude 3 Project. And before we get started, we just want to take this time to thank our supporters. We cannot do what we do without generous support from people like you. So if Jude 3 has been a blessing to you, if you've engaged with our content, remember, we do this to help equip people to know what they believe and why they believe it. And it would be so we would be so delighted if you could come alongside us as a generous supporter. Consider giving a monthly gift or one-time gift. You could do so on jude3project.org, hitting that donate tab, and also rate and subscribe. So if you're watching this on YouTube, follow us. If you're listening on podcasts, audio, rate and subscribe. We would greatly appreciate it. Without further ado, let's get into our podcast guest today, Dr. Carmen Imes. Welcome, Dr. Imes.
Thank you so much, Lisa. I'm just delighted to be here.
I'm delighted to have you. You've been on the podcast before. You've been a part of Courageous Conversations in LA. So tell our audience a little bit about who you are.
I am a professor of Old Testament at Biola University here in Southern California. I'm a lifelong learner. I have a background in missions. My husband and I served in the Philippines as missionaries to Muslims. And I think probably right now what occupies my days most is trying to take scholarship and make it accessible for people in the pews. And I'm just finding there's a whole lot of people out there who want to learn more and want to grow and are grateful whenever a scholar takes the time to talk to them in language they can understand. So that's been a really fun part of my journey.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's awesome. I'm thankful that you do that. I didn't realize you were a missionary in the Philippines. I don't know if that ever came up in our past conversations, or maybe I just forgot.
Maybe not.
But we're talking to you about your latest book. What is the title of your latest book?
It's called Becoming God's Family, Why the Church Still Matters. Mm-hmm. It's out October 28. I'm holding an advanced reader copy, which is, still got typos in it. but it's so exciting to be close to releasing the book. This one is my love letter to and for the church, about the church, and it's more personal and pastoral than my previous books, and I am so excited to share this one with others.
Awesome. So what made you want to write that? Your first two books were around, what was Sinai? I can't think of the
Yep, that's right. So the first one was Bearing God's Name, Why Sinai Still Matters. And it's about how if we want to understand our vocation as Christians, we need to go back to the Old Testament, back to Mount Sinai. That's where God calls his people into relationship with himself and gives them a mission to represent him among the nations. So it starts with the command not to take the Lord's name in vain. I have a more expansive view of what I think that command is saying. And then I trace that theme of bearing God's name through the whole Bible. The second book was Being God's Image, Why Creation Still Matters. And it starts in Genesis and looks at what is our identity as humans and what is the work that God's given us collectively to do in the world. And as I wrote that book, I wrote it through the pandemic. And it was a time when most of us were not able to gather with our church communities.
Mm-hmm.
We were kind of forced to join with each other on Zoom or on Facebook Live or whatever. We were finding different ways to connect. And I think what the gift of the pandemic, it was lots of awful things, but the gift that it gave us is that collectively and globally we had to reconsider, what is it we're even doing when we do church?
Mm-hmm.
What's essential, what's non-essential, what can be done over YouTube or over Zoom, and what are we missing
Mm-hmm.
when we gather virtually? And I realized as the pandemic was winding down and we were starting to gather again, I realized there were a lot of people who were choosing not to come back.
Mm-hmm.
It was kind of an easy exit ramp because it broke our weekly routines of gathering. And I realized that we would need to make the case again for why the church matters, why it's worth it to connect. Why not give up on the church when there are so many headlines that show us hypocrisy in the church, when there's abuse and cover-ups happening in the church?
Mm-hmm.
Why stay connected? And so it was my attempt to help Christians re-engage with the question of church, to do so with a sober and realistic view of what the situation actually is. I'm not trying to cover over the hard parts of church. We look at them full in the face, but also painting a hopeful vision for what we could become.
Mm-hmm. So for those who are watching, why should they re-enter? Or why should they be a part of the family of God? I think we live in an individualized culture where people are like, I
Do.
watch it online. They feel
Yep.
safer watching it online because they don't have to deal with people. Uh,
And isn't that the case? Like it's messy to deal with people. It's uncomfortable. Sometimes people disappoint us. Sometimes they even hurt us. Yeah, why should we reconnect? I would argue that the Christian life was never meant to be a solo enterprise, that we cannot be who God has created us to be on our own. We can get like a glimpse of it. We can like dabble in following Jesus, but to fully follow Jesus involves becoming a family with other believers and doing life together.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that's, we had a courageous conversation pop up in Chicago. And one of the things that came up was AI, right? And people using AI for different things. And I've been seeing, AI being a romantic partner, a
Mm-hmm.
platonic partners, like
Mm-hmm.
substitution. And I would
Yep.
argue that a part of in the technological age that people are turning to electron or artificial intelligence is
Mm-hmm.
because of the messiness of relationship,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
right? And
Yeah.
so just like people will stream online for safety, they will
Yeah.
do relationships because they want the benefit of the relationship, but not the
Yeah.
challenge that it brings. And
Yep.
so I think all of this conversation about like connectivity with people is
Mm-hmm.
super important, not only just for
Yeah.
church, but even just how we do life in community. And with the rise
Mm-hmm.
of technology, will that
Mm-hmm.
be another way in which we dodge
Yeah.
interpersonal relationships?
Absolutely. I think the past several elections have been really hard on the church
Mm-hmm.
because it's shown either exposed or caused a divide or rift between
Mm-hmm.
generations and between different factions of people who are now like, I can't worship with you
Mm-hmm.
because of how you vote or don't vote. And that's been another real challenge where I think that for the younger generation, it feels like to go to church would be to become complicit with certain ways of thinking
Mm-hmm.
about politics that seem toxic. And I just really believe that that part of what made the early church almost like magical, that's not the right word, but what the powerful work that the Holy Spirit did in the early church was to bring together people who did not normally hang out together, and to bring them around the same communion table to share in the memory of Christ's death and resurrection, and to be on mission together. And it was rich and poor, slave and free, Jew and Gentile, male and female. It was a community that cut across all of the barriers. And I think if we were the early church, then Paul would be talking about Democrat and Republican, sitting around the same table, worshiping Jesus together, that we would learn to love one another through our differences, to have more productive conversations together instead of just shutting each other out.
Yeah. I think the challenge, when I think about that, I think about my pastor says, my pastor that's here in DC talks about the fact that we often forget the diversity of thought that was around the 12 disciples.
Yeah.
So
Yes.
Matthew the tax collector
Yep.
and the zealot.
Yep.
And so when we think about a tax collector and a zealot being in the same group of people,
Mm-hmm.
how much did they have to wade through just on how they saw the world to
So
follow
much.
Jesus
Yep.
together? Like,
Yep.
put all
Yeah.
these people that were, I mean, I just think about Matthew walking into a room and everybody looking like, you are the cause for my family losing their stuff.
Yeah. Yep.
And then Jesus
Yeah.
saying,
And
I'm sending you on mission together. Like, that's crazy.
yes, and Matthew had walked away from that. Like, he'd been in bed with Rome, but he'd walked away from that to follow Jesus. And Judas the Zealot had also, like, he had built his career on being anti-Rome, but he left that to follow Jesus. And so they share this discovery that Jesus is worth giving up everything for. And I think part of the problem in the church today is that we're known more for our politics than for our faith. And so people actually haven't given up their allegiance to a political party to follow Jesus. They've made that allegiance to politics their primary identity. And so then it becomes really hard to become a family with each other when that identity gets in the way.
Yeah. I think that's super helpful. To also note, like, these two people with ideologies had these ideologies going into their walk with Jesus, but once they encountered Jesus, they abandoned those to follow him.
Yep.
I think it is hard to walk with people that are a part of a system that is hurting your people. Right.
Yes.
And
Yes.
Jesus is,
And yet there are so many who don't see how it's hurting other people, right? Because the church, what is the saying? 10 a.m. on Sunday is the most segregated hour of the week.
Mhm.
Because we tend to worship in micro demographics, we often are oblivious to the way that certain policies harm our neighbors. And we become committed to those policies because we think it's good for us, and our us needs to expand to include people who are not in our micro demographic. One of the great travesties of this age is that there are even church planting strategies that are trying to raise up churches on the basis of a homogeneous unit. So I'm going to target Black urban professionals with no kids, or I'm going to target, white suburban families with kids in public school, or whatever. Like, we have actual church planting strategies that say you'll grow faster if you just try to get people together who are exactly like each other. And I think Paul and I think Jesus and I think Peter would be like, what? That's precisely what we're trying to overcome. We're trying to bring together every tribe, tongue, and nation around the same allegiance to Jesus. And as long as we keep doing that and we end up with echo chambers, we will be divided over politics because we will forget how to love our neighbor because we don't know our neighbors.
Mm-hmm. When I think about becoming family and I wonder what the scripture would say in regards to people who we can't walk together because other people refuse to see how they're harming the other.
Mm-hmm.
And so to come in community with a group, like, the ideal is we come together, we hear each other's perspective, and then we change based on those things. That is rarely the case, right? It is ideal. It's the ideal, but it's not the case. Right. And so people are forced to stay in spaces where they're not being seen, heard, their concerns are not being addressed. And so to tell them to stay and bear in this place seems really just not helpful.
Mm-hmm.
And so they're like, I want to be a part of the family, but not this family. So they always have to
Mm-hmm.
like quantify, like, or say, qualify, I'm a
Mm-hmm.
Christian, but not this Christian, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because these
Mm-hmm.
people are harmful. Um,
Yeah. Yeah.
what does the scripture lead us to think through in that,
Mm.
in when we think about becoming family?
Yeah. Let me say, my mind's going in two directions. First, let me say that I do have a section in the book on good reasons to leave a church.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think it's like stay at any cost. I think it does depend on whether the church is a healthy community where I think if you find abuse is not being dealt with or it's being covered up, or the leadership is authoritarian and they're refusing to see and hear and empower all the members of the church to bring their gifts and participate, I think that's a problem. I think if they've lost their moorings in the Word of God, if the Bible has become a suggestion or kind of an antiquated document that we find inspiration from, but it's not our authority,
Mm-hmm.
then those are problematic and it's time to go. And there may be other reasons to go, including your own mental health as it relates to involvement in a particular place. And as we consider the question of race, I think this is a particular place where people of color often are carrying a tremendous burden of having to bend over backwards to fit into majority culture.
Mm-hmm.
And there comes a point where it's like I can't bend anymore. I can't carry this weight anymore. So that brings me to my second thought, and that is I start in the book with the story of Abraham and Sarah.
Mm-hmm.
This is kind of a natural place to start because this is the place God calls a family to become a nation through whom all nations will be blessed.
Mm-hmm.
But right from the get-go, we see that Abraham traffics his wife twice and benefits handsomely from it, that they then abuse their Egyptian slave, Hagar, and sexually abuse her, and that she runs away. And so I think when we look at the way that God meets Hagar, it's a really interesting commentary on how to handle the church today when the church is harmful, because Abraham and Sarah kind of represent the church in the Old Testament,
Mm-hmm.
and they get it all wrong. They don't get everything wrong, but they get a lot of stuff wrong. And God actually meets Hagar outside of that system and sees her and cares for her needs. She runs away twice. The first time, God sends her back. She doesn't think she can stay in this any longer, but God meets her and gives her a sense of agency and hope for her future that enables her to go back. This is a tricky biblical story because this is not a paradigm for everybody should go back to an abusive relationship. For sure, it's not that. But I do think that in Hagar's current state, she would have died in the wilderness. She's a pregnant woman with no support system, and she's in the desert where there's no resources. And so I think for her own safety, God sends her back for a time. But the second time, she leaves with God's blessing and she strikes out on her own. And I think maybe that gives us some wisdom as we think about the complexities of church relations today. There may be a time to leave a particular church, but we need to make sure that we're looking to the Lord. The Lord is not constrained to working within a particular local congregation. He can meet us outside of that. But I think the witness of Scripture shows us that He doesn't mean for us to be on our own, and He's going to send us to be part of a community where we can find support and offer support to one another.
Mm-hmm. No, that's good. I love that you brought out that particular time Hagar's life where she left. Because I think that part was crucial, that she's in the wilderness and she's pregnant. Because people are like,
Mm-hmm.
why would God send her back to that?
Yeah.
Like, and it's
Yeah.
and the point you made, if she had to stay in her current condition in the wilderness, she could have died and she could have not.
Easily.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so she goes back not to stay permanently, but to get enough strength to actually leave.
Yeah.
And
Yeah. And when she leaves the second time, she and her son are on the verge of dying, and God meets them in that place and provides for their needs without sending them back. So there's not just like one size fits all for how to survive the life of faith or the life in the church.
Yeah.
I have left churches and I have stayed, right? There was a season in which my husband and I were discerning, like, should we stay or go? And the pastor was a very controlling pastor, and he was not open to anyone kind of bringing their whole self to the task of ministry. It was like, it was all him. I remember he asked me to be part of a monologue or a small play or something that was around the holidays. And he gave me the script, and then he proceeded to coach me through the script and correct every way I said every sentence so that I'd say it his way. I was like, wow. So you even need to like tell the woman how to talk on stage if she's going to go up and do this thing. And I had a background in drama theater. Like, I was not new at this. But he was kind of like micromanaging it. And this is how he approached all of ministry. And we just got to the point where we couldn't sit under that kind of leadership anymore because we felt like it was sucking our souls dry. We're currently in a church situation where we don't totally agree with the leadership on the question of women in ministry. And yet we've chosen to stay because we feel like if we keep leaving a church over differences in theology or in practice, then we are seeking a kind of echo chamber that's impossible to find. And as soon as we find it, it's only a matter of time before we are going to leave again over a difference. And so right now we're in the hard season of learning to love and be loved by people who land in a different place theologically. And that's been actually a really hard and beautiful journey.
No, that's helpful. Thank you for sharing that. When I think about so there's different degrees, right? So we're talking about as we communicate this about church and engaging the family of God, there's a spectrum. So every church is not abusive. Every church is not
in fact, most of them aren't.
Yes, most of them aren't. So there's a spectrum of reasons that people leave. Some of them are because they were in a multi-ethnic space and they didn't feel validated. Some is that they were in a space and their theological perspective was not in alignment with the leadership, or some have left because of women in ministry. So we've kind of stayed in that kind of space in this first part of this conversation. But I want to move to what I feel like is often the most common, because most of us are in homogeneous churches. But even in the homogeneous churches, there's still conflict, because we can all believe, quote unquote, the same, or all be the same race, all be the same kind of socioeconomic, and there still be conflict. So I want to move from the kind of what we see, the cultural things that come up and the theological, but just to interpersonal, even when you're somebody that kind of same race, same way of thinking generally about the Bible, but the conflicts still come up. What should we be thinking about there?
I think we should be thinking about the radical call of the New Testament and Old Testament. The Old Testament's telling us to love our neighbor all the time, but the New Testament call to love one another across differences, to work past the things that divide us, to work through them. I found Scott McKnight's approach to the book of Romans really compelling, because he has a book called Reading Romans Backwards. He says, we come to the book of Romans and we think, oh, this is Paul's great work of theology. And we start at the beginning and we're trying to understand the idea of justification by faith without understanding that the end of the book is actually the doctrine in practice. Like, what Paul's trying to say in the book of Romans works its way out in chapters 13 through 16, which we sort of often are inclined to look at as kind of the fluff at the end of the letter. But that's actually where it's all driving. So chapter 16, where Paul tells everybody to greet one another on his behalf, is actually his doctrine in practice. What he wants for the church in Rome is that they will all begin to treat each other like family. And he lists all these people, male, female, Jewish and Gentile, Greek, Roman. There's such a variety of types of people in chapter 16, and he's asking them to talk to each other on his behalf. he's giving them an assignment. It's a group project to go out and say hello to each other. and I think we miss how significant that is in terms of why he's even giving us the theology of the initial chapters. One of the things I learned as I was working on this book that was new to me is that in the first century, the sibling relationship was the most important one. It was the primary relationship that required the deepest loyalty and commitment, not marriage, but siblinghood. So if I'm married and I have a brother, and my husband and my brother are both asking me to do something, and if those two requests are at odds with each other and I can't do both, then every time I'm going to choose brother over husband.
Wow.
And I don't think that's really how things typically work in the US, at least not in white culture. You can tell me how it is in Black communities. But what this tells me is that when Jesus and Paul use the language of siblinghood for fellow believers, they are choosing the strongest language available to them to tell us how we're supposed to interact with each other.
Wow.
And I don't think they're saying we need to like reorganize how our family culture works in the US in 2025. But I do think they're telling us that the church, the people sitting beside us on a Sunday morning are to be like siblings to us, which is to say we need to reorganize our values and priorities around their flourishing, and so that we can truly support one another like a family. And that's radical. So when divisions come up, and you asked about, divisions and problems in the church, you don't get to choose your siblings. You're just born into a family and you're kind of stuck with your brother or your sister. And sometimes trouble comes, but you got to work it through because you're stuck with each other for the rest of your life. And in a similar way, we are stuck with each other in the church, and we need to learn how to work through those differences and come out on the other side.
Wow. That's paradigm shifting. That whole situation with the brother, the siblings, right? Because
yeah.
In our culture, we have the highest achievement of relationship is romantic.
Yeah.
Particularly marital, right? And
yeah.
so
Yep.
There's this thing of people opt themselves out of church community because they have a marriage and their own children. And so they're like, I don't have the capacity outside of my family unit that I've built. Yep. God is not calling me. My first priority is my family. And
I'm like, you haven't read the New Testament, because the New Testament actually says that your church family is supposed to be your priority.
Yes. So that is shifting. That's altering to culture that's very countercultural. But also when I think about how radical it is, I think about our language around capacity and what we think we have space for. So most people, between working 40 hours a week, between their children, their commitments, their own traumas they're trying to work through and wade through, most people would hear that and say, I can't do that. I will excuse myself from that because I'm not called to that. I don't have the word will be, I don't have the capacity for that.
Yep. And there's a lot of people out there who just say, I don't even have the capacity to show up on a Sunday morning for church. And I want to say, so I actually had a student who came to me last semester, and she's like, okay, so your Old Testament class is not required for my program, but I've been hearing really good things about it, and I kind of feel like I'm called, like maybe God is nudging me to take your class. But I just was hoping you could help me sort of sort through that question, whether it's a good idea for me to take it or not. And in the course of the conversation, I had a chance to ask her, so what role does Sabbath have in your life? And we talked about the importance that the Bible places on rest. And she understood Sabbath. Sabbath was a thing. And she said, oh yeah, if I take your class, I'm going to have to give up my Sabbath. I said, oh, that one's really easy. God is not calling you to take my class if it means giving up your Sabbath, because God asks us to rest one day a week. And I think we can use a similar matrix as we're thinking about church. if God calls us to become a family with other believers, and he says, do not give up the habit of meeting together, then if your schedule does not allow you to meet with other believers because you're over capacity, then there is something you've said yes to, something you've put in your life that God was not asking you to do. Because I don't think that God asks us to fill our life so full that we don't have time for church. Now, let me quickly add that there are some professions that God calls people into that make Sunday morning attendance a difficult thing. Like I'm thinking of somebody's got to be a nurse on a Sunday, right? There's patients in the hospital who need looking after.
Mm-hmm.
There are certain professions that have to work on a Sunday morning. But there are other ways to stay connected with a church family or church fellowship, even if you can't show up regularly on a Sunday morning. So I would say if your job does not permit you to show up weekly, then still find a church to attach to and find ways of involving yourself throughout the week with those believers somehow, because if you don't have the capacity for it, there's something off in your concept of what your life should look like.
Yeah. And I love that you brought that out about even Romans, going back to the relational part, because when I read 1 Peter 3:15, earnestly contend for the faith, and I think about it in the context of 1 Peter and what Peter's saying in 1 Peter 3 before he gets to 15, it's all about how we interact with one another, how we with the most critical relationships. He talks about the spouse, how you care for your spouse in 1 Peter 3. He talks about how you care for one another, how you act in the most challenging, forgiving one another. So if I'm forgiving a person, that must mean the relationship has been strained, right? They've done something to hurt me. And so he's talking about how we treat one another from the relationships that we desire and the relationships that are hard. And then he says, based on that, people are going to ask you about why you believe what you believe, because you treat the relationships that are close and difficult with a level of care, concern, and you handle the people in a way that the world doesn't handle people. And that actually draws the questions about how you live the way you do. And so to me, then apologetics becomes a relational exercise, right? It becomes the exercise of relationship, that the best apologetics is done in the context of not just the relationship with the person that's being questioned about their faith, but the ways in which you do relationships that invites questions of other people.
That's good.
And so what you're writing about is all about relationships, because the Christian life, my therapist said this to me yesterday in our session, the Christian life, she's convinced, is all about relationships, relationship with God, a relationship with yourself, and a relationship with one another. And so you cannot do this walk as a Christian apart from a relationship. If you are, you're not doing it right.
I totally agree. And I think that in the West, we have often thought of Christianity as a set of beliefs that I need to mentally assent to. Like I need to check the box on these doctrinal commitments, and that's what makes me a Christian. And our beliefs are important. What the Bible teaches is important, but it's not about, it's much less about getting the right boxes checked. And it's about entering into relationship with Jesus, with the church. I've been thinking about how the Bible calls the church the bride of Christ. And I think it's fair to say that Jesus is not a polygamist. He only has one bride. And so if we're going to become the bride of Christ, we need to actually become united with one another. We can't be off doing our own thing. It's not just about me and Jesus. It's about us and Jesus. So again, we don't get to pick and choose who's in the church. We are gloriously stuck with all the others that God has invited in. And as we challenge one another, and as we have these tensions in relationships, that's what helps us to grow in Christ-likeness. That's where the rough edges get what's the word, sanded down
Yeah.
in us as we have to come up against relational tensions. And we can try to avoid that. You mentioned AI earlier. Let's just have an AI romantic partner, or let's have AI generate sermons for us, or let's just watch church online. There's this kind of disembodied and and disconnected kind of way of thinking about the Christian life, but we miss out on all the development that God has designed for us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love that you said that, because I think relationally, one of the biggest missteps the church has made is pushing only people to work through things, romantic and marital relationships. And so reconciliation is a muscle that has to be developed, and it
Yeah.
cannot just be developed in the context of romantic.
Yes, that's right.
You have to develop it in relationships that you don't feel like you benefit from, right? So people work because they like, there's an aspect of the romantic relationship that they can't get if they're following Jesus outside of him. So that whether that's the sexual relationship or just the person being there all the time, the companionship. But when it comes to people that are in platonic space, it's like, oh, I could just replace you.
Yep. I find another friend who gets me better.
Yeah. And so because that has been a muscle that hasn't been developed, being in community becomes very difficult, because it's like, I only work where I feel like it benefits me, but this doesn't benefit me. And so it is.
We don't think it benefits us.
Yeah.
We don't see what riches are available to us. We size people up. They walk in the room and we're sizing them up right away. Does this person have something I need? No. Right. Like that's the ugly stuff that's going on beneath the surface.
Yeah.
I first heard David Bennett on your podcast, Lisa, and that podcast episode is one I now share with my students every semester.
Oh, wow.
Like it's my favorite podcast conversation I've ever heard. And I keep telling people about it. It's been a couple of years since I heard it.
That's humbling. Thank you. So, David did a phenomenal job.
It was beautiful. David, I think what David does is he helps us understand not just what the Bible's saying no to, but what the Bible's saying yes to in such a beautiful way. And so I went and read his book, A War of Loves, after that. And he says in that book, marriage is not the ultimate or even the greatest form of intimacy that can be experienced. And he helps unveil that lie that marriage is the ultimate and the main thing. And he helps us to see how our relationships our friend relationships and our siblinghood is actually central to what it means to follow Jesus. And I just think this message is so important in a world where so many Christians experience same-sex attraction. And the church is saying, the Bible says marriage is between one man and one woman. So then what happens to all those who are going to be single because of what the Bible teaches? And if we as a church continue to send the message that marriage is the ultimate form of adulthood, or like now you've arrived in some way, instead of what the Bible actually teaches, which is marriage is a good thing, but it's not the highest good. The highest good is us becoming a family as a church. And if we become family as a church, that includes singles. It includes young and old, and crossing those barriers to become a new family is, I'm captivated by this idea because I think in some moments I've had glimpses of what this can be like in the church, and in other places I'm like, I don't even think we have begun to see what this could look like.
Yeah. I think it is the ideal that has yet been realized in our communities of faith. Like, yeah.
I have a colleague who told me a story a few weeks ago, and I am still I can't let it go. This is crazy. This is crazy good. So this colleague was at a part of a church 10 or 15 years ago where they had a significant number of dreamers. So these are children who were brought to the U.S. by their parents. They don't have legal authorization to be here, but they were underage when they came. So it was not a choice they made. So they're classified as dreamers. whatever place our country was in politically, the church became concerned that some of these children might be deported under a new administration. And again, this was 10 or 15 years ago. I don't remember. I don't know exactly which election we were on the verge of. He wasn't specific. So they got together as a church and they're like, all right, let's adopt all of them. So they literally adopted. They divided up the kids between all the families of the church, and all 20 of them were adopted. And so my colleague has a couple of adult children now. He's raising children of his own, but he has a couple of children who are now adults, who are pastors, who were dreamers. And he said, okay, come in, be part of our family. And I was like, whoa. I just wrote a book about how the church is supposed to be a family, and I don't think I've even scratched the surface.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think God is calling us to be way more entrenched in people's lives than we have thought.
Yes.
And it becomes
Absolutely.
harder and harder for us to even conceptualize it the more individual our culture becomes. It is.
We're supposed to be entangled with each other in a healthy way. And we're so fixated on autonomy and self-actualization and self-fulfillment. We're on our own personal quest to be our best self, that we miss out on actually God didn't design us to be autonomous. He designed us to be interdependent, to collaborate, to work side by side. And we're missing out on so much when we're just on our own quest. And I think that so many Christians treat church as yet another tool in their self-actualization toolkit. I go to the gym on Monday. I go to the therapist on Tuesday. Whatever else is on your list of like, I do my daily Duolingo, like whatever education. And on Sunday, I, show up at church, and it's just to make me a better me. It's not to become something together.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned entanglement. It makes me think. So a few years ago, there was this whole thing with Will Smith and his wife, Jada Pinkett, and she had a extramarital relationship with the singer. And when I guess they have like an open marriage, or they're like separated but together. It's a very interesting dynamic they have relationally.
Okay.
So Will Smith knew about their relationship, and he was okay with it to a degree. And so when they had they did like an interview red table, and she said, when he asked about, because he knew about it but the world didn't, so when the world found out, they were like, oh my gosh, like she's cheating on Will Smith. And so when Will Smith interviewed his wife about it, and he said, well, what was your relationship with the R&B singer, was August Alsina? She says, we were in an entanglement. And so that became like this whole cultural word. And so when you said entanglement, it like made me think, because not in a necessarily negative way, it's reframing. When we hear entanglement, we think a toxic relationship, because there's a way in which we can be enmeshed and entangled with people that becomes toxic. Yes. And so when we hear of like enmeshment, entanglement, it all jumps to toxicity. The reframing of it is like, we had Hakeem Bradley on to talk about James, and that how, in James, we fight because we want our own way. And so it becomes toxic when we're fighting for ourselves in the relationship. It becomes healthy in the entanglement when we're fighting for the other.
Yes. I love it. That's it.
Is that the distinction?
That's it. Yes. The entanglement I'm talking about is the entanglement where I'm not okay if you're not okay. Like if you're struggling and you're my sister in Christ, then that pulls me in a healthy way, because I want to contend for your flourishing. And so instead of just being like, oh yeah, they're that's them. There's a kind of belonging to each other, where we're so networked together that when you pull one thread, they all get pulled somehow. There's like a web.
Yeah.
And I think
Charlie Day says the Bible is like that. If you pull a thread in Genesis, the whole scripture crinkles. Yeah.
That's great. Yeah, and I think relationally that's supposed to happen. And we're experiencing this in our church right now where one member is particularly struggling and you can just feel the strain on everyone as we all want to figure out how do we love him well in a tricky situation.
Yeah. No, that's good because I think that like the reason we walk away when the relationships get hard is because we
Mm-hmm.
were fighting for ourselves. We weren't fighting for the other.
Yeah. Yeah. That's
So
good. That's good.
when you don't get your own way,
Mm-hmm.
it's like I'm not getting my own way. I'm not getting what I want from this. So I have to leave.
Yep.
But then we go to Paul, love doesn't seek its own way, which is echoed
Yep.
in James when he say you're fighting because you want your own way. Like, and so the
Yeah.
tension there is like, I think that's a beautiful like distinction that'll help us even think through like what are the culprits of us walking away, because it can be abuse, it can be those things what we were talking about in the first part, but many times it's more of the latter than it is.
Complacency, a disconnect. This isn't serving me anymore.
Mhm.
It doesn't, I don't have the capacity or it doesn't fit my desires this week. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think people think nobody will notice if I don't show up. It'll all just go on as it was. And I don't think we realize what a difference it makes to show up, to make eye contact with people, to shake hands, to give hugs, to become to walk side by side with people in their weekly struggles. And you might feel like you're not making a difference in your church because you're not in some leadership role or you're not doing some prominent ministry. You just sitting alongside someone and asking them how was your week
Mm-hmm.
can actually make a huge difference in someone's ability to cope.
Mm-hmm.
As we become connected to each other. This past week, I had another kind of mind-blowing moment at church. So the week before, I was hosting our service, which involved leading the prayer time.
Mm-hmm.
And we were praying for one of our members who was going to have brain surgery on Tuesday. And as I made that announcement so that we could pray, I didn't know this guy. And so I just said, are you here today? And he raised his hand. So I put face and name together. Okay, this is the guy having brain surgery. He had brain surgery on Tuesday. He had a couple of days in the hospital recovering and then went home and had a couple of days recovering. And on Sunday, we were walking forward to take communion. And to my shock, there he was. There he was, post brain surgery, walking forward to receive communion. And I thought, whoa, for sure, nobody would have batted an eye if he was absent today. Like if he didn't show up, we'd all been like, man, he's recovering from brain surgery. But this guy did not want to miss a Sunday. He wanted to be with his people and he wanted to worship his Lord. And so he showed up. And I thought, wow, how many of us are just like, yeah, it's been a long week. I think I'm just going to opt out. And like, if you can show up the week you had brain surgery, anybody could show up.
Yeah, that's amazing. Well, this has been a rich conversation. Is there anything else you want to talk about, address in your book that we haven't? And how can people get your book? Yeah. And get connected to you on social?
Okay. So I would say one of the things I'm trying to do in the book is tell lots of stories. So it traces a theme through the Bible of God's people gathering around God's presence. Mm-hmm. To paint that picture for us. But I also tell lots of stories. I've moved a lot, been a part of a lot of different churches because of that. And I think we hear so many headlines. We watch so many heroes fall that we can start to think that this is the norm. And there are so many little churches in out of the way places where people are faithfully showing up and loving one another. And those are the stories we need to hear. And so I'm trying I'm not shying away from the difficulties of church, but I also want to say, look, there's a lot of good stuff happening and we're going to miss out on that because the Spirit of God shows up when we gather and I don't want to miss that. Mm-hmm. So I hope that this book is a note of hope, not just a here's what's wrong, but here's what could be right if we all plug in. People can find the book wherever books are sold. It comes out October 28th. Mm-hmm. So I hope people pre-order it. And people can find me. I'm on Facebook, on X, on Blue Sky. I just joined Substack and I'm getting ready to start a Substack newsletter and have a website that's just about ready to launch. So I'm out there. People can find me. YouTube. I have a YouTube channel where I release weekly videos. And right now I'm in the middle of a series on book recommendations on different topics. So if you're like, what do I read to grow in my faith? That's a place where you can go and check out recommendations.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Imes. This has been a rich conversation. Thank you all for tuning in. Remember, my book, With Faith Disappoints, is available wherever books are sold. You can catch all our past episodes on our YouTube channel, on our website, jude3project.org. All our resources are there, curriculum, online courses, all the things. As I mentioned at the beginning of the episode, you can become a donor at jude3project.org, hitting that donate tab. Until next time, grace and peace, and God bless.